Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. We're going to have a great meeting tonight. And we're thrilled to welcome Jamel Brinkley, who will read from his new and already acclaimed book of short stories, Witness. He will be joined in conversation by Carmen Maria Machado. Witness is Jamel Brinkley's second collection of short stories, and it includes 10 stories set in the changing landscape of New York, where he was raised. He has spoken about the inherent or residual mystery of places we know best, and a deep knowledge of New York informs these stories as they address a transforming landscape. Witness is a theme that moves through the book and is informed by James Baldwin's concept of what it means to witness actively, to see what is there rather than what one wishes were there, and to respond to that reality as humanly as possible. Justin Torres astutely says that Witness is a book of psychological acuity, of graceful sentences, of devastation, and of hurt. Jamel Brinkley's first collection of short stories, A Lucky Man, won the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence and was a finalist for numerous other awards, including the National Book Award. He has also been an O. Henry Prize winner. He has also won the O. Henry Prize, the Rome Prize, a Wallace Stegner Fellowship, and a Lannan Foundation Fellowship. His work has appeared in the Paris Review, A Public Space, Plowshares, and Best American Short Stories. He was raised in the Bronx and Brooklyn and currently teaches at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Carmen Maria Machado is the author of the memoir In the Dream House and the award-winning short story collection For Body and Other Parties. She has been a finalist for the National Book Award, the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her essays, fiction, and criticism have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Granta, Vogue, This American Life, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she is currently teaching. Jamel will read first and then be joined in conversation by Carmen, and then we will have time for audience questions. Please welcome Jamel Brinkley.
Hi, everybody. Jan, thanks so much for that introduction. Thank you to Prairie Lights for hosting this event. Thanks to all of you for being here. It's really nice to see so many familiar faces to come out and celebrate a book of short stories. I've been instructed to read for about 20 minutes, which I'm going to do. And I've decided to read from a story called Arrows. I'm going to read from Arrows for a few reasons. One, it's the most explicit ghost story in the book, and that seemed appropriate for a conversation with Carmen. Another reason I'm reading it is because it's the oldest story in the collection. I drafted the seed of what became the story over 10 years ago. And I don't know, I thought it would be a nice example of like kind of letting something sit and find itself and not being impatient with your work. So what I'm going to do is to kind of I'm going to give you an approximate experience of the story. So I am going to get to the end of it somehow. You know how Alice Munro has that description of the spatial experience of a story is like walking through a house. So if Arrows is a house, I'm going to show you like 30% of the rooms, maybe. What you need to know is that the narrator is named Hassan. And he is hell-bent on selling the family home in Westchester, New York. Everyone else in the family is against this idea. Hassan's father, who is blind, Hassan's young son, whose name is Zahir, and Hassan's mother, Helena, who, by the way, is a ghost. This is Arrows. Helena Porter kept her room the way she said all bedrooms should be kept, like a lady's armpit, neat, bare, and inodorous, not accessible to the eyes of enemies or strangers. This had little to do with propriety, however. A private room kept with this kind of bodily sanctity could, my mother believed, shelter her impatient, fumbling heart. She thought of these qualities, impatience and gracelessness, as particular to the hearts of ladies, to their outwardly refined yet inwardly childlike insistence on handling flames, the flames of longing or of love. According to the terms of her personal lexicon, a woman was a lady only if she was fascinating and ungovernable, and my mother considered herself nothing if not a lady. This was true before the accident, which happened when she was on her way back from one of her dalliances. And it was true, I'm sure, in the moments after the terrible collision, as she sat crushed and semi-conscious in the driver's seat. It was true even now that she was dead. There she was, the ghost that was my mother, sitting hunched over on the left side of her bed. When I reminded her that I was taking Pops up to Hillside the next day, she raised her immaculate face up at me and ruefully shook her head. So you're really going to take my man away? She spoke in the usual tone of her mothering, uninvolved and opinionated. Then she went back to what she was doing, attending to her toes, brightening the nails with the same chalky hue of white that dominated her walls and linen. The room had looked that way for almost 15 years, ever since Pops had gone fully blind, when what had been their room became hers. Is it really happening so soon? She said, keeping a careful eye on her toe work. I don't remember it being so soon. You sure are in a rush to get rid of him, my man. It's a good place, I said, frowning at her endearments. They specialize in folks with Pops's condition. I specialize in other people's mess too, Helena replied. Then she had the nerve to say, it's called being part of a family. It's just what you do. You find ways to live with inconvenience. You could go with him, I told her now, to the home. A smile grew hideously on her face. The bottom line is this, son. Yes, you have the license to do whatever you want with the house, even if that means taking my man away from me. But I am not giving up my room. We're not done here, I said. Oh, we are. So you want me to sell a haunted house? Don't act brand new, my dear. It would be far from the first time, she said. What old house isn't haunted? The dead shouldn't be so selfish, I said. Well, she dared to reply, neither should the living. Staged homes apparently sold faster and for better prices than homes in their naturally occupied state. The stager had said it was important to showcase the house free of any stubborn emotional connections that were particular to our family. She'd respectfully advised, for instance, that we move the etched black and gold urn where Helena's ashes were kept from its place above the faux fireplace. Selling, not dwelling, was her company's guiding principle, according to which she had made every room alien for us, but easily navigable for any forthcoming strangers. Every room, of course, but my mother's. I knew well enough to stop her when she tried. Ghosts have been in my family for generations, but the ones on my father's side tended to be of the flimsier sort, available more to the ears than to the eyes of the living. My mother, on the other hand, had the telltale visibility and near corporeality of many of the ghosts on her half of the family. This quality made it difficult for living witnesses to keep the necessary boundary, to distinguish between traces of things and the things themselves. You could treat the ghosts of my father's people like an overheard phrase of a familiar tune, taking notice of it, and perhaps, for better or for worse, remembering, but only for a moment. With a ghost like my mother, however, you had to be careful. Before you knew it, that quivering body would firm into a pillar, around which your entire life, here and hereafter, would everlastingly revolve. So at this point in the story, the narrator's young son, who's a little boy, Zahir, is there in the house that the narrator wants to sell. And Zahir and the narrator's father are starting to show some resistance to the idea of selling the house and of putting the father into a home. Um, Something came to my mind then, my theory about how a ghost begins. The idea had a hoodoo grandiosity that did not come naturally to me, but had to exceed my own limitations to come to any kind of understanding. I called my idea the arrow of time. Some people live with an almost appalling optimism, a sense that every next meal, every next sip of wine, every next tryst will be better than the last until the day they die. And if it wasn't, oh well, then the next one would be. Such people tolerate the past, give it their merest acknowledgement, the way you might quickly raise and lower your head to a passing stranger. Other people, people who tend to become ghosts, are different. They're the ones who turn around to face the past, and then they get impaled by the arrow, stuck on something that happened to them or on an obsession. They're the ones who can't accept people's inevitably forward movement through the entanglements of time. Zahir flung himself from his chair and had an uncontrollable fit on the floor. Not that I tried to control him. I just watched it happen. Ugliness was the theme of his outburst. I was ugly. Pops' new house was ugly. And because he didn't recognize it, so too was the current one. Maybe, I thought, this was what would make him turn around and get stuck by the arrow. It seemed possible that his ghost would start today, at once, a tiny vapor inside him flaring up and pulsing alongside his quickened heart. Maybe he would haunt this house too, like my mother, refusing to leave the place where perhaps his purest happiness resided, and where it was taken away from him. His ghost would arrive here to find my father's ghost too, and perhaps mine, though I often felt trapped in moments further back in time. Briefly, the image of our ghostly reunion had a certain appeal. With Helena upstairs, coming and going as she pleased, the three of us would be fixed inescapably in the amber of this scene, at the model dinner table of the model dining room of our imperfectly modeled home. So now Hassan is packing up the last of his father's things. I sat on his bed and began the task. Pops had said there were just odds and ends left to pack, but what I found there couldn't be called miscellany. The items were mostly iterations of the same thing, a collection of framed photographs of my mother. The first few were mostly familiar to me, but then there came many, more than 24 of them, that I had never encountered before. For a long time, one in particular held my attention. It was a picture of Helena, Pops, and me, a close-up shot of our faces. They were holding me up between them, and I couldn't have been any older than Zahir was now. As the lamplight played over the surface of the frame in my shaky hands, I began to notice how heavily smudged it was. I looked more closely and saw that the glass was filthy with fingerprints. I examined the other photographs again, removing them from the box I had placed them in, and was astonished by how obsessively traces of touch filled the planes. My father must have groped them all with a manic frequency and with a maniac's compulsion to undergo an experience in its cosmic entirety. But I didn't understand why. His eyes were essentially useless. and there were no textures for his fingertips to decipher. I was so absorbed in this mystery that one of the house's typical eruptions, a creaking noise in the hallway, startled me, and my knee whacked one of the frames from the bed to the floor. Helena had probably just returned from her affair. I leaned over to retrieve the photograph, which was the one of the three of us. The glass still held together, but it was now filigreed, an intricate web spread across our faces. Instinctively, I picked up my phone. I had the urge to talk to someone about this and about everything that was on my mind. I pulled up my modest list of contacts and scrolled through, but none of them meant anything. It was just a roster of connections that had been lost. I didn't have anyone to talk to, so I just stared at the screen. Eventually, I noticed a blurred reflection of a single swimming eye, like a fish twitching in the murk. When the glass of the phone went black and depthless, it threw my entire exhausted face back at me, with only slightly more clarified gloom. I lay back on my father's bed within the walls of my old room, where he had frequently beaten me when I was a child. I let my head fall to the side so I could look out the window. An old feeling returned, the desperation to escape this house and be done with it forever. I rested the idle phone along my temple and my cheek. It was late on a Friday, so if she, tonight my intimate, was a she, and her name, so it came to me, was Esther. If she answered her phone, it would sound in the background like she was out at a party or a bar. Esther would tell me to hold on for a second. When her voice returned, the background would be quieter. Aside from the intermittent shrieking of passersby and the occasional shush of car tires on the damp city streets, she'd probably be searching through her bag for a lighter and her cigarettes, which she called her blues. She would address me sweetly, "Hey, stranger." I would say I was thinking about my mother, and she would make some joke in reply, something like, "Never call a girl to tell her you're thinking about some other girl." Then, knowing, as they all did, where this call was going, Esther would exhale smoke and remark on something irrelevant and disarming and mock poetical, like the night sky, or on the moon in particular. And then, committing to this deviation, digging in her heels, she'd quote some obscure line of verse. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. She would tell me to look at the moon now and how beautiful it was. Though the blinds were raised, the moon wasn't visible from where I lay, but I would agree nonetheless. She and I agreed, of course, about what we found beautiful. She would narrate at length some fable about the moon's formation, and despite the pleasure of her voice, I would get irritated finally and tell her I had called to talk about something real. Knowing everything, as all my intimates did, she would say that was funny coming from me, the boy whose ancestry was intangible, a genealogy of ghosts. I would ask her what she thought the qualities of my own ghost would be. She would say I might be the first person in history who would shatter into ghostliness, producing not one, but many. I would ask why, and she would say, "You're full of arrows, Hassan. You just can't let anything go." And then there would be an awful gap of silence filled only by the occasional splash of the city's noise. She would say she needed to get off the phone, and I would tell her to wait, that I had more to say, that there was more I wanted to tell her. And she would end the call by saying that I always had words, words upon words, an infinite abundance of words. But would I ever be able to say one true thing that could save me? Another noise, a sharp rapping on the door, made me startle. When I opened it, Zahir was standing there in the dim glow of the hallway's nightlight, his face waxy and tight with sleep, eyes glued nearly shut. "I heard people talking, Baba," he said. "Go back to bed," I told him. "Don't worry. That was just me." Later, Zahir was out of bed again. He stood at the other end of the hallway this time in front of Helena's room, He turned to me, and the features of his face still appeared to be closed, like the folded petals of a tulip. I hear people talking, Baba, he insisted sleepily, and then he reached for the doorknob. Just as he started to push into the room, I bolted across the hallway and grabbed him, lifting him into my arms. He hugged me tightly. Tightly, he wrapped his legs around my waist. As he began to tremble, weeping quietly over my shoulder, I held the back of his head. I didn't know why he was crying, and I got the sense that he didn't know either, that he was just reverting to the wordless instincts of a confounded baby. Or it was possible he had seen something. The door to Helena's room was only cracked open, and it probably hadn't been that way long enough for him to catch sight of anything. Still, he was right. There was noise coming from the room, though it seemed less to me like words than the throat song of yearning. When I stepped forward and pressed my eye into the crack, it got quiet, an abrupt snuffing of the sound. The room was hazily lit, but it didn't take long to make out the dusky shape of my mother on the bed, facing the foot of it. I couldn't tell for sure, but Helena appeared to be looking at me too. She tilted her head downward, and I realized she wasn't alone on the bed. And then it became clear she was astride him. I hadn't seen them together since before she died, and hadn't seen them together in this room since she had claimed sole dominion over it. My base imagination of what they were doing quickly yielded to the much stranger actuality of what my eye perceived. He reached with the fingers of both hands, slowly up until they broke the permeable barrier of what would have been her rib cage, and sank into her. Then, after a moment of tremulous suspension, he drew the fingers out, knuckle by knuckle, and with what felt to me like all the pleasure that can inhere in hesitation, he reached up and into her again, as if she was his own personal cloud. I tore myself away from the door and carried my son downstairs. But I was unable to sleep. I felt stabbed all over by what I couldn't unsee. Bitterly, I also felt I was the only one there who hadn't been granted any exemption from time, the only one for whom the pressure of tomorrow would not even temporarily relent. So I just lay awake listening to the creaks and groans of the house until the sun began to rise. As I put Pops' things into the car the next morning, I was surprised at the meagerness of his possessions. A couple of suitcases and a couple of boxes. That was all. As if he was heading off for 2 weeks of vacation instead of hauling away the equipment of an entire life. It was almost time to go, so I steeled myself for what felt like the first action that was truly irrevocable, the task of actually removing my father from our family home. When I closed the trunk, though, he was already emerging from the front door, led with great concern and patience by my son. Pops refused to let me help him get in, and Zahir tried to mimic this defiance as I secured him into the car seat in the back. Up in the house, at one of the windows to her room, Helena looked down at us. I couldn't see her expression, but I could clearly sense her frustration and her fortitude. She rattled the panes violently with both hands before she disappeared from view. The drive was quiet aside from the low, indiscernible music coming from the radio. I wanted to say something, but I also didn't want to surrender the mercy of that silence. When we stopped at a traffic light, I studied Zahir's enigmatic expression in the rearview mirror. I was so transfixed, the car behind us had to honk to make me aware the light was green. From that point on, I kept looking back at him. We ended up arriving at Hillside late because of a detour, but in one piece, despite the difficulty I had keeping my eyes on the road. The detour had come toward the end of the drive. I took an impromptu right turn and proceeded in that direction until we reached the parking lot of a train station by the lower Hudson. Pops and Zahir were confused as I urged them out of the car. On the other side of the station, after you descend a long staircase to the platform for southbound trains, There was a place I knew where you could have a special experience of the ever-changing river. I led my son and my father down to that place. From there, where today the river appeared swollen from the rain, we could taste the faint, bracing stench of the leaden water. We could feel on our skin the flexing of this arm of the sea, and hear in the spring breezes the heavy admonition of its rush. This was a place where you had a chance to unburden yourself, where your concerns might be shaken off or transfigured or washed away. We stood out there for a few minutes in sensory plenitude. Then Zahir took Pops by the hand to guide him down a few more steps and then forward along the edge of the river's bank. I watched them walk parallel to the flow of the Black Hudson as for the moment it roared south toward the harbor. In no time at all, much more quickly than you would expect of a blind old man being tugged along by a fickle little boy, they opened a great deal of distance between us, as if they were frightened of me, as if they were taking flight. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I am so glad you read from that story because I have a whole question about ghost stories
Cool.
in my list of questions. So we're gonna start there.
Okay.
So I was thinking when I was reading this book about two collections that I've read, Wells Towers, Everything Ravaged, Everything Burned, and also Savia and Liebrecht's A Good Place for the Night, which are short story collections where the majority of the stories sort of occupy a shared genre and sort of shared reality. And then there's one story that sort of takes flight into an entirely different genre. And so I wanted to talk to you about the decision to write about ghosts in this particular way, like not as metaphors, but as like very literal people. And just your decision to do that. And I mean, saying that's the old story makes this even more of an interesting question. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, like where did that come from? Like, what is it about sort of that shift in mode or that shift in like an agreed upon language? Like, yeah, like what, I guess, yeah, where did this story come from? Like, why in this book? And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of the problem with that story when I first drafted it was that it was coy about the mothers being a ghost. And so it was sort of this goofy story I wrote where it was like, ooh, people are going to be so intrigued. Is she a ghost or is she not a ghost? It's very unclear. It's ambiguous. And the story was so bent on preserving that sort of useless ambiguity that it didn't really get to what the story was actually about, which was the resentment of the narrator, the possibility and the refusal of forgiveness on the part of the narrator. And so, what I came to realize is that I needed to commit to there being a ghost. Like, this is a ghost story. And then that decision opened up so many other things for me. I said before I started reading that it was the most explicit ghost story, and I would argue that there are. I would argue at least that this is a book full of hauntings, and that there are other kinds of more subtle ghost stories in it for sure. And I think that my interest in the idea of haunting and the idea of ghosts comes from really a lot of the reading that I've done and thinking that I've done about the experience of African American life. Some of the thinkers that I value most dearly are people who talk about African American life as being a haunted experience, or Black Americans having a unique experience of time, for instance. The idea of an experience that shaped historically by so much loss, and that loss leaving not absence, but all these seething presences. And I kind of wanted to capture that and look at that in a lot of these stories in lots of different ways. Yeah.
Um, I have I had actually forgotten. I had a question here about structure, but then and I had forgotten that this story also does this thing, which this gesture that I've always found really interesting, where a story is being told chronologically. There's sort of a pivotal moment where there's a gap, and then the story continues. And at the end of the story, we return to the missing piece. So in this story, it happens very slightly, where it's like they kind of get to where they're going, and then we kind of get this like memory that had happened just before. And then also Bartow Station does that as well, right? Where they this sort of couple that's together for a little bit and then stop seeing each other, like have this like conversation that we do not see on the page. We see the sort of fallout from it, and then at the very end of the story, we see it. And I've always found the structure like, and I notice it because I think it's such an elegant. I feel like it's always such a surprising sort of elegant sort of structural choice. And I guess like yeah, like when you approach like how a story is structured, and you're thinking like the architecture, speaking of like hauntings and haunting houses, like the architecture of the story. What sort of is the, I guess, yeah, like how do you approach structure, that gesture in particular, in terms of thinking about haunting, this question of hauntings? Like, does that feel, I don't know, is that a kind of ghost or yeah.
Yeah, I love that last suggestion. Is that a kind of ghost? And I would say yes. Um, I think there's something that happens when you sort of establish powerful forward motion in the story, and then strategically, or you feel your way into disrupting that forward momentum, right? Because to me, what it suggests is that the thing that pops out of the chronology and kind of ends up at the end is the thing that the narrator has the most trouble assimilating, the thing that the narrator has the most trouble just absorbing into the flow of experience, right? So it pops out of time. It's the thing that lands at the end because it's the thing that's most unsettled, the thing that's most haunting, for sure. So in this story, and in the other story you mentioned, Bartow Station, that's why those moments come at the end, because the thing that the narrator is unable to ease into the flow of time is the place where the story lands. Not because the narrator has figured something out, but precisely because the narrator cannot figure out, what.
It's like undigestible or
Yes,
something.
yeah, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
This question of so many of these stories deal with grief and loss. I'm thinking of what you just said about like the African American experience and thinking about these ghosts and these presences. How do you feel? And like the way I feel like this book also deals a lot with like how those things either encourage or dissolve intimacy, this grief and this loss. So how does this theme, do you feel like it connects this idea of bearing witness?
Yeah, it's a good question. James Baldwin is definitely, probably the presiding spirit over this book. And some of my students and former students are here, but I kind of force upon them some of Baldwin's ideas about I mean, it's in a couple of his essays, but one in particular that's become very dear to me over the past couple of years is called The Uses of the Blues. And in that essay, in the beginning of that essay, he says outright that, when he says the blues, he's kind of not exactly talking about music. Like he doesn't really know much about music itself. What he's talking about is how you deal with pain, with trouble, and the importance of dealing with it, because we all have to deal with it. And that falsifying your experience, not bearing witness, is sort of pretending that pain doesn't exist, right? So he starts with the blues because in the blues, the subject matter is about natural disasters, heartbreak, lynchings, whatever you want to talk about. But the importance of it is the singing of it, right? That you face these things down and you're making art out of it. And so for me, I think the idea of bearing witness is about that confrontation, with the fact of loss, of pain. And that, I mean, it's interesting. There's a way of reading that essay I referenced in which you can say that the real craft move, because he says it's an essay about craft, the real craft move, the most important craft move is maybe something that sounds simple, but is not simple at all, which is just facing the fact that this is what human experience is about, right? So the idea of bearing witness for me is about, as much as possible, a beautiful singing of these stories of trouble. Yeah.
When I wrote my first book, I remember not realizing until an interviewer asked me, like months and months after the book had come out, they were like, "Oh, all these stories are in first person. Why?" And I was like, "They are." Like I literally did not even not realize or had not like fully. And I was thinking about this collection again, this question of witness, because you do have like a mix of first and third in here, and about like the choices that might lead you down one path or the other. Like I still do a lot of like interrogation of myself as to like what is it about me and the style that I write in, that I seem to like automatically go into first person when I start writing. So I don't know if you have any like, yeah, like, and I also just think about like, yeah, like almost like distance in terms of like a first person or a close third versus like more distant third, and like how you sort of approach that subject of POV.
Yeah. I think what comes to mind when I hear your question is, yeah, there are a mix of first and third, mostly first, though, in this book. And I think that's no accident. There is that kind of Ellisonian autobiographical chronicle, fingering the jagged grade stuff going on with that choice of first person. But I was also really interested in these stories and trying to explore specifically the first person point of view, because it's so limiting, it's so difficult. It may seem easy, but I mean, it's actually difficult to write in first person, and there are a lot of problems it can pose for you. And so I think in the stories, I was trying to stretch as much as possible within the first person point of view. So I have a story that kind of goes from a first person plural to a second person to a first person singular. I have a story where, in other ways that the appearance of the eye is sort of deferred, delayed. You have all these characters whose intention is to hide, right? And my job as the writer is to not allow them to hide, right? And just kind of draw them out, make sure the stories draw them out, and make sure these characters are revealed in all their vulnerabilities, and all their prejudices and all their desires. And so for me, I think, thinking of the idea of witness, in terms of point of view, I wanted the stories to be not only about the perception of what's external, the perception of what's out there, but also the exploration of the person of the witness themselves. That sort of exploration of the I, even when the I doesn't want to be pinned down and examined. How do the stories, reveal these seers? Yeah.
Um, you've now written 2 short story collections.
God.
As someone writing her second short story, I feel this very strongly. And I was also thinking a lot about the way that short story collections, I don't know if this word will speak to you, maybe it speaks to me, accrete. Like I feel like there's this way that they sort of, it's almost like a stalagmite or stalactite sort of like developing, where there's like this little thing, and then but then like the way that not just the stories themselves, but the collection begins to have sort of like an echo or like a conversation, and how that makes a collection really like when it's really working, it really speak. And so could you talk about just like your approach to like the collection as a form? So like not just thinking about individual short stories, but thinking about this like, sort of very beautiful, very like sort of precious form, that I think that you and I are both so obsessed with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. This collection came together differently than my first one did. The stories in Unlucky Man were written mostly when I was a student here at the workshop. And I'd written a ton of them. I've written like 12 or 13 stories somehow over the course of 2 years. And then what I realized was that only 9 of them actually had anything to say to each other. And so the other 4 kind of went missing. And so it was a process of seeing, after the fact that I did have a body of work that could cohere. That's what happened with that one. But this one, I think I was just a few stories in before I started to see those echoes. And I actually worried about it. I thought I'm the sort of writer who values a generative uncertainty. And so when I see something, when I think I know something too soon, I get concerned. And what I thought was that, having a unifying idea too soon to make the stories too similar or too narrow.
Determinative or something.
Yes, exactly. Determinative. And I didn't want that. And I was so worried about it. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the idea of witness and, a lot of the Baldwin stuff and other stuff that I was thinking about hauntings. I realized how capacious actually the idea was. And so I felt like I could still pursue it and write a range of stories that had that unique mix of affinity and difference that could, they could go together in a book, you know? So I'm glad that, this collection came together, even though it was in a very different way. Yeah.
I wonder how much that has to do, because I feel like my experience is like similar, and I'm wondering if it's about just like being a younger writer versus a more experienced writer. That like, because I feel like also in the beginning, I like also had no sense of like what was actually happening, and it took me like really examining it to realize like, oh, I have stories that are like speaking to. But I feel like then with like my newer work, it comes faster because I feel like I have a better sense of like what my own brain is doing, which I feel like I don't know, at least to me, like when I was a younger writer, it just felt like a lot of that was such a mystery. And there's still like mystery, but I feel like I'm faster at picking up like what my brain is trying to process or something.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about this. I think that's right. And I also wonder if it has to do with teaching.
Oh, that is actually a super good point. Yes.
Because there's something about, because again, I wrote those first stories when I was a student. And these stories I'm writing as I've accumulated teaching experience. And there's something about the experience of being a teacher where you're kind of detecting patterns. You're seeing things, you're diagnosing, just that your analytical brain is activated a little more quickly. And I kind of want to like, I love my teacher self, but I also have to like beat my teacher self.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have solved a lot of narrative problems of my own because I'm being forced to articulate to a third party like something that makes sense to me internally, but I have not yet like said out loud. And yeah, you're right. Like you do have to like learn how to like diagnose. It's like a very intense word, but like it's true. Like diagnose and like feel like what is working and what's not, and then be able to explain it to somebody else and do so like on a semester timeline, like in good order. So I feel like yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense that maybe that is part of it too. We'll do like one more question and then Q&A. Yeah, okay. Oh my goodness, let's see. So there's a moment really early on in the book that made me feel really safe as a reader, which is a feeling like I feel like there's always like a moment in a book where I feel like I'm like, oh, I'm in good hands. I mean, I already knew I was in good hands. It's your book, but I feel like in this book, I feel like very good. And the moment was in the first story, nothing had changed about the status of the building. It hadn't been sold to some developer, at least not yet. But for whatever reason, parenthetical, we knew the reason. Certain cruelties of the law were now being strictly enforced. And it was that little kernel of that parenthetical that was just so pointed and so quick. And I was thinking a lot about this issue of like, like establishing trust with a reader or like the relationship between like a reader and the writer. And if you had any thoughts about establishing trust, either with a reader or even as yourself as a reader, like with a, when you experience trust, something that you're reading.
Yeah, wow, what a great question. Trying to think. I'm trying to think of your question in terms of that first story, actually, and why it's the first story. And I think, and hopefully this speaks to your question about, feeling taken care of. But I think there's something about even just the very first utterance of that story that I think, I want a reader to feel like they're in a very particular world, with certain kinds of characters, right? Without signposting it in a crude way. I want to feel like, you're being ushered into a certain vernacular, a certain rhythm. You know who these people are. So welcome in, right? I hope you like it here. And I think that combination of the vernacular, the diction, the rhythm, then those little moments, right? Where I think what you're talking about is that there's almost like a meta intelligence that's peeking out of the story. And I think that intelligence is the one that we get at the very end of the story more fully, right? This maybe speaks to that idea, The other thing I would say though is because this is a book that's so much about, difficult subject matter, there's medical racism in the book, there's deed theft in the book, there's the violence of gentrification in the book. There's a way in which I wanted, to me, the moments that I think hopefully help you feel like you can face that material and read that material. So I wanted there, and I said this about my first book too, I wanted there to be a moment of beauty or a moment of joy in every story, So in that first story about this group of friends, there's this moment where they have this complete kind of ecstatic dance party in the street. Even with everything else that's going on, there's this moment where you see that despite all the stuff I'm saying about, the fact about African American history and, sort of dealing with the fact of loss, there's also this lot of other stuff going on, these full lives, the pursuit of pleasure, pursuit of joy, and the achievement of it, which I think is important. And to me, that's something that maybe makes the stories feel like they're more serious. They're serious about the difficult subject matter, and they're also serious about the light, you know.
I have one more very quick question about that story, which is the scene with all the rabbits.
Yeah.
Is that from like an Iowa? I was literally like, is that an Iowa City moment? Because I'm thinking about how like when I was living here, I feel like there were rabbits constantly everywhere.
Yeah, I'll answer that real quick. I think rabbits I mean, the Iowa rabbits must have been on my mind.
Yeah.
Because I was, when I first moved here, I was completely charmed. When I saw the first time I saw a rabbit in Iowa City, I was like, oh my God, what is that? What is happening here? Is this a thing that happens here? I'm coming here from Brooklyn. What? It was so magical to me. So I think the Iowa City rabbits were on my mind. But actually when I lived in Oakland for 2 years, there was this strange place, exactly like the place in that story that opened up on the corner of the block where I lived. It was full of rabbits. And I was like, what is this place? It was so weird. No one was ever in there. It was just rabbits. I was like, this is so strange. I went in there one day. It was a huge mistake because I felt like I had, given permission to I had basically been ushered into a cult just by walking in. But I was thinking about that place most explicitly. But the magical Iowa rabbits must have been there too.
Sure.
All right, everyone. So we have about 10 minutes to open it up for questions. And then afterwards, if you have a question, I encourage you to come up, get a book, get it signed, and pay for it downstairs. All the books are pre-signed. If you want to actually like inscribe, just come up and ask for that, right? For your name, right? We're on with that. Okay. And then don't forget to pay for it at the register downstairs. So thank you. Okay. We're not ready to clap yet. I mean, we can, but yeah. Yeah. Who would like to ask our first question?
Hi.
Hello.
Okay. Hi. So my question is, I think you were mentioning earlier about generative curiosity, right? Okay. And I'm curious to know, like, when do you like sense or know that a story is like done, because especially with short stories or have like a lot of like space to like have a plot that's like spanning like 38 years, and you can, but it is very difficult. So like, how do you know that it's done, and like, how do you personally know like where each plot beat goes, where the characters are going, and stuff like that?
Wow. Okay. That's a great question. I think for me, the path to knowing that a story is done begins with figuring out what its essential shape is. You know, and I don't always know that because I sort of write stories in a exploratory mode. I'm kind of finding my way to the ending, and by the time I get to the ending, I have kind of all these wrong turns in the story. Sometimes, fatal wrong turns. I need to go back and take another path completely. But once I figure out the essential shape, I think the essential shape can, at least for me, can kind of bear um, little wandering, little textures. And there's something about the story fulfilling its essential shape that lets me know that I'm like close to being done. I don't know that I have a rule or a formula like aha, it's done. Um, but figuring out that essential shape is crucial. Figuring out, those kinds of echoes that you were talking about earlier, Carmen, is important. The ways that different parts of the story speak to each other, build upon each other. I think that's the other thing I would say is that there's a certain point you reach, and it doesn't feel very good, but there's a certain point you reach where you know that everything you do is making the story worse. And once you reach that point, you're probably quote unquote done. Or done-ish. Done-ish. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. Um, I was really drawn to this. I was like sitting down here and like closing my eyes, and I feel like your narration really like built me in the world. I felt like I had the spatial map of the house, even like driving to the river. But there was this particular moment that I felt like I was like, how did you do that? So I want to break it down. It's the protagonist basically being like, how is my father like, yeah, trying to, it becomes like I person, like very me, and then he starts to, you start to use reflecting surfaces as a tool for him to self-reflect on how everyone is doing. So the first thing is like the glass, him seeing through the glass that's intact, and the glass is also a form of like self-reflection, but seeing also through it of the family photos with this like spider web, which then goes beforehand, I think was like his child having that tantrum or afterwards and him reflecting about the ghost, but also the example of like, what was it? Something optimist. Yeah. And then this example of like digesting, like people usually drink wine. And I was thinking about glass, wine glasses. I just really like the visual, like, I don't know what, I'm not a writer, so I don't know, but I don't know, techniques, modes, whatever you were using to have this sense of reflection, like object reflection, but also the person was also reflecting on how their child was maybe going to become a ghost, how the ghosts were coming up. And I found that to be really beautiful. And I just felt like you were bringing up into so many spaces. One of them was like, here's my idea of how I think people relate to optimism. And here's how I relate it to how ghosts are formed. Here's how I relate to my dad being blind but wanting to touch these things. Here's how I relate to my son having this tantrum. And then also further down, I think at the end, as soon as I heard River, I was like, oh, it's on. Like I was like, I knew because it reminded me of like Toni Morrison's work where like they take flight at the end. And I just was like, okay. And so, okay, I see all this. I love what you did there. And then my question is, do you think Hassan, he was talking about the when you catch an arrow, that's really when you become the ghost. Do you think that Esther was right about him having the most arrows? Do you feel like he's dodged them? Or do you feel like the choices that he made has led everyone else to catch their own arrows?
Wow. That
Can I
was
just say
great.
that was like one of the best questions I've
Yeah.
ever had. Yeah.
What can I say to that? Well, first I want to say the phrase you were looking for earlier was appalling optimism. Just so we all remember that. So, gosh. Okay, so here's the thing about that Esther moment. The Esther conversation was entirely in his head. He was not talking to anyone. He invented that, right? So he actually like detail by detail was going through an imaginary conversation with someone, which is an index of his loneliness, right? That he has to sort of make up an intimate to have a conversation with. And so when Esther is telling him these things, she is telling him things that he already kind of knows about himself, right? So that shattering into ghostliness, I think he knows that he is just he's fully aware of his inability to kind of let go of the past, right? He's fully aware of his inability to forgive, right, and to take on the difficult responsibilities of being a family member, right? But despite knowing that, and despite the resistance of his ghost mother, despite the resistance of his father, despite the resistance of his young son, he still goes through with his plan. And so I think when he's talking about that arrow, he knows, he fully knows. So is Esther right? I think she is. I personally think she is right. And by saying that she's right, it means that he knows how vexed his decision is. He knows how vexed the decisions that he's making are. He's going through with them anyway. And one last thing I would add, when you were talking about all the objects, right? And the meaning that's sort of attached to the objects or the reflections that are kind of prompted by the objects. To me, it's about the objects. The way that I get there is by paying very close attention to those things in and of themselves as things, right? If you look close enough at the thing, then you can start to see so many things in it, right? And so the important thing for me is not to reach for symbolic or metaphorical meaning right away, right? But to sort of sit with the objects as tangible things, right? Until they start to become strange and interesting and prompt thinking. So that's sort of my path to get into some of those things that you were very kindly talking about. And thank you.
That's why you word wood. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you, Jamel, so much for that wonderful reading. And thank you, Carmen. Hi, Jamel. And thank you, Carmen, for the Q&A. Yeah, so I guess my question is about just returning to work, because as you mentioned, I think you said this story had been kind of like 10 years.
Yeah,
in the
2012, that's when I drafted it.
So I'm just really curious about the process of going back to work and kind of seeing who you were as a writer then,
Yeah.
and then kind of making a collection and like looking for patterns in a voice when you have basically just different writerly selves in tandem with one another. So I guess, yeah, what's that experience like?
Yeah, embarrassment is the first word that comes to mind. Even you know what? Even beyond the fact that particular story is like a decade old, there's something embarrassing in the confrontation with your former self, just in the process of publishing a book. Because by the time you have like sold it, the book comes out typically 2 years after that, right? So you're sitting there revising the thing and then editing the thing, and then proofs come out. And you're like, oh my God, I have to read this again, right? But part of that, oh my God, is not just being sick of your own stories or whatever, but it's this confrontation with the self that already feels old in a way, right? And so what I encounter is embarrassment, first of all, but then the nice thing, or what I try to do as a nice thing, is to show my former self some grace, and to realize that this is who I was, at the time that I wrote whatever story I'm looking at in the collection. And I think that's really important. But in terms of that story, taking the really long view of work that's 5 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old, in a weird way, embarrassment is part of it too. But actually, there's a way in which there's just a lot of pleasure in putting something away. In this case, for years. Like I had kind of forgotten about that story. It had a really terrible title too. I'm not even going to tell you what it was. No, it's so bad. You will boo me out of the store. Okay, it was really bad. Um, but but the clarity is incredible. You see stuff in that mess, and it kind of was a mess, or something that seemed impossible. Like, how am I going to fix this story? Like, there's no way I can fix this story. You read it a couple of years later, you're like, oh my God, yeah, I see how to fix this story, right? Or at least you see a path, right? You see the way that you can go. And so, mixed in with that embarrassment is this sense of grace, is this sense of clarity, and that feels really good.